Billions in spending, billions in deficit and debt. Ontario's fall economic update promised a lot in health, in infrastructure and education, but did not include a path to balanced books. Let's find out more about this government's priorities. From the Frost Block across from Queen's Park, there's Minister of Finance Peter Bethlenfalvy, who's also the Progressive Conservative MPP for Pickering-Uxbridge. Minister, it's good to have you with us tonight. How are you doing?
Doing great, Steve. It's great to be with you again. And before we kick off, you did a great job hosting the Celebration of Life for Premier Bill Davis. I was honored to be there for part of it, and it was such an uplifting time and a celebration of a great man.
It was that. Thank you for saying so. Let's just share with our viewers stuff you introduced this afternoon already, and that is $189.1 billion in new expenditures, and here's how some of it is divvied up. You've got, for health care, almost 37% of that directed there. That's almost $70 billion. Education at 16.3% at more than $30 billion. Limited COVID-19 funding at 5.6%. That's more than $10 billion. Interest on the debt's going to run us 6.9% of spending now. That's more than $13 billion, with $168.6 billion in revenue. You got elected, and I mean you personally now, in large measure, I know, because you wanted to put Ontario's, I guess as you describe it, financial house back in order on a stronger financial footing. How do the items that you outlined this afternoon help do that in your view?
Well, first off, I think our number one job in government is to support people and health when things are tough. I can imagine what it was like to sit in the legislature in the 40s when we were in World War II, and you would have done the same thing, put every resource possible to support the troops and support Canadians to defeat the enemy. This time it's an invisible enemy, COVID. It was the right thing to do, and we'll continue to fight the pandemic and protect the investments and the progress we're making fighting that pandemic. We did signal today that we're going to start focusing on economic recovery more than we have in the past because we are making good progress, and we got to look to the future somewhat. Now, these deficits and these debts they're not desirable and they're not sustainable in the long term. And as I outlined in the March budget, we have a plan to balance them over time and with various scenarios because it's volatile and still uncertain. And we'll update that in the spring budget. But today was very much about protecting our progress, combating COVID-19, and then building Ontario and working for workers.
Let me just ask you a bit of a philosophical question for a follow-up here, and that is, the Premier is sort of famously these days trying to portray himself as the man of yes, whereas the opposition are saying no, no, no to everything. He's saying yes to new spending, yes to new highways, yes to new this and that. Are you trying to send a message here that in some ways attempts to rebrand or rethink what it means to be a Conservative nowadays?
I think what this is about is supporting all Ontarians, supporting hardworking Ontarians and their families, and we slipped backwards over the last decade or so in terms of Ontario being the economic engine of Canada, and we slipped backwards in terms of investing in healthcare. And I think what this Premier is very focused on, and he's been focused on this his whole life, is being there for the little guy, little gal, little person to fight for the voices that sometimes don't have voices at Queen's Park, and lift all Ontarians and lift the economic engine for all people in Ontario. So that's the driving force, and he believes strongly, as do I, that the path forward is economic recovery, economic growth, and economic prosperity, and that's a big part of who he is, and it's a big part of who I am, and it's a big part of our plan that we tabled today.
But I want to hit on that again. Are you telling us today that conservatism as defined in the year 2021 can include significant government spending and less concern about deficits and debt?
No, not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that we needed to invest, and I'll be frank, I think we as a society underinvested in the last decade or two in our healthcare system. We've got an aging population, and you can't have a healthy economy without healthy people. So I think what this is really about is not a philosophy per se from an ideology point of view. It's a philosophy that says you got to make investments both in people and in things, infrastructure, to have a successful society, both socially and economically. And, politicians, as you mentioned, I got into politics in part to fix the books, the financial books, but also to help rebuild the economy. When my parents came here, we've talked about that before, from war-torn Europe, Ontario was the economic engine of Canada. And I think we can retain that spot again and lead Canada and really lead North America. So I think it's less about philosophy or an ideology, and things like working for workers and standing on the podium as I did with the Premier on Tuesday with Jerry Dias, the head of Unifor, and Smokey Thomas, head of OPSU. We fundamentally believe that there's more jobs than workers. We got to all work together if we're going to rebuild and make this province stronger.
Well, to that end, and I know there is some controversy about how the bookkeeping is done here, but I'll just quote the independent, nonpartisan financial accountability officer who said that you guys budgeted X number of billions of dollars in the past for pandemic spending and then didn't spend it. So I guess the follow-up question is, how do we know that the money that you have budgeted for spending today is in fact going to be spent?
Well, I always appreciate the work and the very important work that the Financial Accountability Officer does. But let me just highlight that his analysis always is a point in time. It's not not all the information, because things happen after the fact. The books that the Auditor General signs off on, which she did, again, a clean opinion, my fourth clean opinion, which matters. I think if you want to have good books and reliable books, signed off on a clean audit for last year where we saw a record increase in spending and COVID spending of $19 billion and, important strategic investments to beat COVID. And so that money was all spent, and we're continuing to do that again this year. Now, I'm the finance minister. I have to be prudent and make sure that there's enough resources financially to be able to fight whatever's around the corner, not just the program spending that we have today, but also for uncertainties. That's why there's a contingency fund, if you will. And I like to look at it the way of, putting out fires. My job in part is to make sure that every truck and every resource is there to make sure we can put out the fire and make sure there's enough water in the fire tank. And then at the end of the year, we do all the accounting, and what the public accounts and the record shows is that we increase spending to do just that, combat COVID, and spend extraordinary amounts of money to beat COVID-19.
Well, speaking of extraordinary amounts of money, I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, who I know is you're a big fan of his, I know that. We're going to ask him to put up
He's
the
terrific.
deficit. Don't tell him that. It'll go right to his head. I'll never hear the end of it. Anyway, here's the deficit projection graphics that we've had made up here. For the budget year of 2021-22, you've got the deficit down significantly to $21.5 billion, down significantly from the forecast at this time last year. And then for the next year, 22-23 at $19.6 billion, and for 23-24 at $12.9 billion. So let's start with that first number. Why is the deficit about a third smaller than what you projected a year ago?
Well, it's because the revenues are greater than we anticipated. Most recessions, and particularly in this one, the financial contraction of the economy was extraordinary in the first phases of COVID-19. We hadn't seen a contraction of the economy like that, I think, in history. But with the substantive financial supports from both the provincial government and the federal government, we actually saw tax receipts go up. And that's never been, at least that I can ever remember, and you and I are both students of history, that in a recession or a contraction that your tax revenues actually go up. So the economy is now rebounding. We've projected growth. We get private sector forecasts to project out the economic growth, and we take their numbers. And the economy is rebounding. Revenue is up. So that's a good news story. However, I will not hesitate to make sure that prudence is in the financial plan so that we've set aside enough COVID contingency or time-limited funding so that we can combat what's around the corner. I'll quickly remind your viewers that the third wave, which doesn't respect our fiscal year end, which is March 31st, peaked in the first quarter of our fiscal year, or the second calendar quarter of this year. And of course, we continue to battle the fourth wave, and I think quite successfully relative to other places in Canada and the world. But we're not going to let our guard down. So it's important as the finance minister that I continue to have contingency funding in place and prudence built in so that we, if we need to make the expenditures, that we have the ability to do so.
I take your point on that, but as finance minister, is it also not your responsibility to lay out what they call a path to balance? You're supposed to tell us at what point the books of the province of Ontario will be balanced, regardless if it's 1 year, 3 years, or 10 years from now. Have you done that in today's statement?
No, you typically do that in the budget, not in the fall economic statement. So I laid out the next 3 years, as you highlighted, in terms of spending and revenue and deficits. In the spring budget of this year, I outlined, it was one of the first governments to lay out a path to balance. And by the way, this today was the 7th time that we've gone out and talked to the people of Ontario about the finances since the pandemic. And we were the first to come out with an economic update in March of 2020. So what I did in March of 2021 is I laid out 3 scenarios, all showing a path to balance based on different economic scenarios. And I'll be updating that again in the spring budget, and that's the time to do it.
In which case, let me follow up with this. Even 3 years down the road, you've got a deficit approaching $13 billion in today's statement. And it does raise the question as to whether or not you can actually demonstrate a path to balance without either raising taxes or cutting program spending. What's the case?
No, we're not planning to increase taxes or cut spending as a way to balance the books. I said in the spring budget, and again today, and we'll be saying it again in our spring budget next year, that the path to recovery, the path to balance is through economic growth. And I said in March that I'm betting on the people of Ontario, and we're rebounding. A lot of what we table today, Steve, is about investing in infrastructure. These are real assets, building highways, building hospitals, broadband, building things, getting things done. Real assets. Those are productive assets. We highlighted the Highway 413 and the Bradford Bypass highway built in the 905. You know, studies have shown that each year congestion and gridlock cost productivity about $11 billion a year. Population's growing in the greater Golden Horseshoe about 1 million every 5 years. So the time it takes to build highways, we're going to have even more gridlock and more lost productivity. So what's important that we do is that we put shovels in the ground today, laying the foundation for prosperity tomorrow. And, Ontario has all the ingredients with fantastic workers. That's why the workers are so important. Fantastic infrastructure, which we're going to augment by building more broadband, more hospitals, more highways. And we've got the entrepreneurial spirit to grow this province. And that's going to be the way we're going to balance the books. And I'm very confident that the people of Ontario will get us there.
I think for the record, your opponents would want me to say that building new highways doesn't necessarily alleviate traffic congestion. It may just, in fact, encourage more traffic congestion, but we'll leave that debate aside for the moment. I want to talk to you about, or I guess ask you about inflation, because, of course, inflation is higher right now than probably at any time in the last 20 plus years. And there's every likelihood, I suppose, that interest rates are going to have to go up at some point in the near future in order to deal with that. If that's the case, do you see gathering storm clouds on the horizon as you try to keep debt and deficit projection numbers in hand, and yet a rise in interest rates could send all that right down the toilet, right?
So I guess as finance minister, part of my job is to look for those clouds. Even when it's blue sky outside, I'm constantly looking for those stormy clouds. And by the way, the highways will reduce traffic by 30 minutes per day. So just to go back to your previous point.
So says you,
rates,
not your opponents. Your opponents say quite different. But anyway, leave that aside.
Well, with 2 million more people in the GTA, they've got to drive. Not everyone can cycle or walk to or take a subway. And so I think we'll be on the right side of that, particularly when you have congestion and gridlock today, but we'll leave that for another day. Your question about interest rates is a very good one. One of the things that I'm very proud of the Ministry of Finance, and particularly the Ontario Financing Authority, is Ontario is one of the best borrowers of debt in the world in terms of terming out the debt, making sure that borrowing is done at a very prudent interest rate. And as you said at the outset, we have 6.9% of our revenues, our expenditures is interest expense. When Canada was in trouble in the 90s, it was up around 33%, the interest expense as a percentage of expenditures. So we've taken advantage of low-term rates. We've locked in 30-year, 20-year, 10-year rates. And so we've been very prudent there. And some would call for a fiscal anchor, if you will, of you should spend not more than 10% of your expenditures on interest rates. So we've done well. However, we've got to have an eye for the future and interest rates, particularly if, as you say, inflation stays high, although many are calling it to be temporary, central bankers and economists. Will put pressure on interest rates, and that's why our prudent approach, I think, is working really well.
I want to ask you about healthcare, because no doubt there are people watching us right now who, because of COVID and because of the way the healthcare system has had to focus on treating people with COVID, they didn't get their diagnostic tests, they didn't get their screenings, they didn't get their elective surgeries that they were planning to have. In fact, again, I'm going to quote the FAO, the Financial Accountability Officer, who estimates that it could take 4 years and nearly $1.3 billion just to clear the backlog of those surgical procedures that have not yet happened. $1.3 billion just for that. You're budgeting today $1.8 billion for health, for everything. How do those numbers possibly add up?
Well, $70 billion of healthcare expenditures, as you mentioned, almost 40% of total spending for an aging population, and layer in COVID. These are extraordinary times, but the way that we're tackling that is we're building hospital capacity. In the spring budget, I mentioned investments in Windsor for a new hospital, in Brampton, in Mississauga, in Etobicoke, in Collingwood, in Ottawa for the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. We have to think down the road to make sure that we have the capacity. So that's the physical capacity. We have to make sure that they're staffed. So hiring more nurses, more registered practical nurses, more registered nurses, more personal support workers, more physicians, and nurse practitioners in this province. Because you can't, if you don't build, you don't need staff. We're building, and you do need healthcare workers. And going a bit further, we put in more money for mental health and addiction to support our frontline health human resources, because that's really important. So, investments we're making today are very important for tomorrow. With regard to surgeries, we announced $548 million today to allow for more home and community care. Those people who have post-acute surgeries and complex health needs, some 28,000 a year of the post-acute surgeries, 21,000 a year of complex health situations will be able to convalesce at home. So we are, big debt of gratitude to our healthcare workers. They're working around the clock to do the surgeries, to take care of people in our homes, and that is something that I know the Minister Elliott, and the total team is very focused on, and we've put a lot of money in to make sure that we can take care of all Ontarians.
Minister, got one more question for you, and that's about childcare. As you well know, nearly every jurisdiction, province, territory in the country has a childcare agreement with the federal government because the feds are offering billions upon billions to help subsidize $10 a day childcare. The word childcare appears once in your statement today. What is the status of the negotiations with the federal government to get this done?
Well, it's a priority for our government. It's a priority for Premier Ford. It's a priority for myself and for the Minister of Education, Stephen Lecce, and our whole government. Good social policy, childcare policy is also great economic policy. So what I would say is, with regard to that, we've had very constructive discussions with the federal government. We had very constructive discussions before the election, and I was very encouraged by the federal government doing a childcare deal with Quebec, with recognizing their unique footprint and their unique investment in childcare. In Ontario, we have a form of $0 a day childcare with all-day kindergarten, which is costs us upwards of $2 billion a year. We doubled the childcare tax credit, and we've put a lot of money in, which you'd note again in the fall economic statement, for creating 30,000 new spaces. So, I think both sides want to get a deal done. I want to make sure that we have a deal that Ontario gets its fair share for our children. That is a deal that recognizes our investments that we've already made, and one that is sustainable over the long haul. In 5 years, there's no deal beyond 5 years. We have to renegotiate it. Well, in Canada Health Transfer, as you know, Steve, it started out at a 50-50 split, and fast forward to today, and today the province of Ontario picks up 78% of the healthcare expenses, and the federal government picks up 22%. We want our fair share there too, as we have an aging population, and we'll fight for a fair share for Ontario children in childcare. But I'm an optimist, so I know everyone wants to get there, and we'll get the best deal for all Ontarians.
That's Ontario's Minister of Finance, Peter Bethlenfalvy, who's the member for Pickering-Uxbridge as well. Minister, we're grateful you spent some time with us on TVO tonight. Be well, and thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.